Hello everybody, welcome back to Psych Motivation. Believe it or not, here we are at Chapter 11 already. Chapter 11 and 12 are going to be about emotion. And motivation and emotion, of course, is our textbook, Understanding Motivation and Emotion. Wow, but notice, in a lot of universities, a lot of colleges, the course is the Psychology of Motivation and Emotion. Here at Ohio State, in our psychology department, we have Psychology of Motivation as a separate course from Psychology of Emotion. Mind you, I'm not complaining. I mean, there's more than enough content to float two separate courses, not an issue. And, as far as job security, I'm fine that they're split up because I get to teach both courses. That adds two courses rather than a single to my repertoire. But I think it's important to understand that emotions have a tremendous motivational quality. And that's really what we're going to talk about in this lecture, how that comes to pass and what it looks like. Albeit this is a very simple presentation of emotion. Those of you who've taken Psychology of Emotion, or those of you who hope to take it in the future, and it's offered both semesters of the year now, it's become a pretty popular course. I'd love to see you there. So let's talk about the nature of emotion, and this leads off with this idea that there's 5 perennial questions, 5 long-standing questions. We can ask the question, what is an emotion? And if you take Psychology of Emotion, you're going to answer that question at the end of the course. We put it off that long. What causes an emotion? And man, that is an incredibly complex question. And there's multiple answers. How many emotions are there? Well, what culture are we talking about? See, I threw you a curveball right off the bat there in not answering that question. What good are the emotions? Well, and I might rephrase that slightly to what are they for? But we'll get to that in a little bit here. What is the difference between an emotion and mood? And of all the things that we can talk about in the realm of emotion, that question is going to be the easiest to answer, and that question has the greatest agreement as to the answer. So what do emotions do for us? Well, they've evolved to help us respond to important situations and to convey our intentions to others. So you can see 2 pieces to the puzzle in a very simple fashion, right? Emotional expressiveness being the result of the second part, and the behavioral kind of repertoire comes from the first part. Put another way, though, and let's make it simple. Emotions are for doing. At least to some of us who study and theorize about emotion, emotions for doing. That's certainly the emotion camp that I'm in. Now, what is an emotion? Got to answer that question. Well, most textbooks will say that it's a 4-part system. So when we talk about an emotion, we can begin with the simplest aspect is the feelings. That is a subjective experience. That is, you're aware that you're feeling something, right? So, and you're feeling this emotion. I feel sad. I feel happy, right? But also, an emotion can be very difficult to distinguish from a thought, right? Or it could be an emotional thought, or is emotion the result of a thought? So, feelings and cognitions. Now, emotions also have a physiological aspect. So, it's physiological activation. And just at the very lowest point, we might talk in terms of not using emotion as a term, but affect. And affect is this general sense of energy, right? So this affective state is, am I down or am I up? Am I feeling tired or am I feeling activated, right? And this affective flow is something that changes over the course of the day, right? It's an ongoing stream. You're never without affect. It's kind of this sense of your life force or your energy, right? But so bodily arousal, it changes just in response to our environment. Now, more significantly though, and especially under threat, it can be preparation for action. So if we sense a threat, the body might kick it into high gear, that is, activate the sympathetic nervous system, or when the action is no longer required, then the parasympathetic nervous system will slow everything down, right? And it's tied thus to motor responses, and it can be tied pretty directly to motor responses. The amygdala has some, down low, kind of automatic, non-conscious links to many aspects, including the motor cortex. Now, let's go on down. We're going clockwise. So, social expressive. Well, emotions allow us to communicate our state to others with whom we're interacting, right? So this can be through social communication. Notice that typically there's maybe at least 3 channels that we can attend to here. In social communication. Facial expression, certainly the most obvious and perhaps the most studied. We have intonation, that is vocal expression, which can change the meaning of a sentence just by the tone in which it's spoken. And then body language, and we can communicate our intent to a certain extent through body language. Sometimes our body language communicates an intent in a fashion that we aren't even aware of. Many people are not all that attentive to body language and its meaning. Now, and body language is kind of a controversial topic too. Some people will describe what they observe in terms of body position, body language, as if it is irrefutable, incontrovertible evidence of the person's internal state. I'm not going to go quite so far, but body language taken with all our other observations can add support to our conclusions about the state of another, or it might detract from it. It might contradict our cognitive conclusions. And then emotions can create a sense of purpose, and this is the motivational state. So us as a functional agent, right, and this is that impel us towards or move us away. And perhaps that's the most fascinating aspect of emotion. So note, though, that it's a significant life event, and then from emotion comes these consequences, right? Well, there's feedback arrows too, leading back to emotion. So it's not quite this simple. But let's get a little more specific. Let's look at the 4 components of sadness then. And I want you to consider now, kind of reflect as I ask you these questions. Sadness is the target emotion of our conversation. What would you describe as your subjective experience of sadness? What do you become aware of? What is your evidence for that, right? The subjective experience of sad, but what does that mean? What does that mean physically? What does that feeling feel like, right? What does it mean? How does it interact with the thoughts that you may be having or the way that you process information, which could be part of the cognition? When we talk in terms of sadness, what does that do to your physiological activation? How would you describe your bodily preparation for action as a result of sadness? Is it increasingly prepared? Is it decreasingly prepared? Right? What might be your likely motor responses that are connected with the feeling of sadness? Okay. Now, let's go to the social expressive component of sadness. How does that affect one's communication? How does it affect one's desire to communicate? How does it show up on one's face? How do you know that someone's sad from looking at their face, or let's say listening to their voice, or perhaps, as the final component, looking at their body language, right? And then the sense of purpose. Well, goal-directed motivational state. What is likely to result during a period of sadness? What is sadness for, might be one way of putting that. Right? So we move through the diagram here. Separation from a loved one, or failure on an important task, which are probably very different phenomenon for most of us. But we can look and we can move through the model in kind of understanding the totality of sadness, right, as an experience in response to an environmental stimulus. Now, What's the relationship between emotion and motivation? Well, emotion is a motivation. Emotions are the type of motive which energizes and directs behavior. And the simplest ways to look at this are approach and avoidance. That anger often makes us want to approach the target that made us anger, to strike out at them perhaps. Fear often causes us to want to retreat from a stimulus object, right? Because of the threat it possesses. So you can see in both cases, behavior is being energized and directed towards a target. Now, there's a third kind of action tendency, if you will, which is to remain stationary. And this is exhibited by perhaps the fewest number of emotions. Most emotions are clearly approach or avoidance. But an emotion like sadness often fixes us in our place. And when we're sad, we're neither approaching nor avoiding, and we often observe an increased level of cognition, something we'll talk about a little later in the lecture as well. So at least 3 physical possibilities are motivational properties to emotion. Now, emotions also then serve as a readout, right? And we can be satisfied with a task, and that makes us feel happy as a result of that, or proud. Or we can be somewhat dismayed about our inability to complete a task, and that might cause us anxiety because it's like, oh, I don't know if I'll be able to do this or finish it on time or do it to the other's satisfaction. So it operates as a readout as well, right? So, in that evaluative process. And you can see then, if we're talking evaluation and we go back to the idea of self-regulation and taking control of ourselves, remember the last step in the self-regulatory process was evaluating how we're doing. And the answer to that question is often in the form of an emotional readout. I feel good about what I did, or I don't feel so good about what I did. Now, what causes emotion? Well, we think that emotions are triggered by a significant situational event, or at least a situational event. But note that this event can be, embedded in reality, can be something that we're participating in that happens, but it also can be experienced vicariously, as in, let's say, watching a movie and watching something happen to a character in the movie that might cause both our cognitive processes and our behavior changes in our biological process. And this then yields, between the combination of the two, those 4 components of emotion we previously described. Now, the biology and the cognition, right? Well, the cognitive perspective and the biological perspective have been an argument since people started considering emotion. But especially as we run into the 20th century, early in the 20th century, emotion becomes the purview of psychologists, greater and greater thought about emotion, greater theorization, and then ultimately leads to hypothesis testing about the nature of emotion. We see 2 camps, 2 groups of people kind of evolve in conflict. That is the cognitive perspective, and they say emotions are a result of thinking, of evaluation. So thought has to precede emotion, right? And this was kind of the primacy argument, which comes first, thinking or feeling. And for this group, hey, it's all about thinking. We think about we think our way into an emotional state, and this would be Lazarus, Shearer, Weiner, among others. Now, the bodily people said no, in fact, physiology dictates emotion, and it's the biology that's the cause of emotion, right? That it comes from some internal state rather than some thinking process. And they fight it out, and they fight it out, and they fight it out some more. And I remember when I was an undergraduate reading a paper by Lazarus, and it was Lazarus arguing with Dr. Zients. So Zients and Lazarus are arguing it out, right? That no, emotion primacy, no, cognition primacy, one precedes the other, and they fight it out. Well, I think what we find out now at this point, moving from the 1980s to our current state, is that emotions can be aroused biologically or cognitively, and that it's often a bidirectional, right, or a circular process, if you will. So it's possible to have emotions arise from thinking, but it's also biologically instigated. It just depends, right? Now, what are some non-genetic sources of emotion? Because remember, the biological people really have to rely on kind of genetic explanations for emotion, in large part. Now, we can find exceptions to that, but conditioning. So classical conditioning, and this is also known as Pavlovian conditioning, right? Note that the emotional relationship of the dogs to the experimental assistant changes. The dogs would salivate in anticipation of eating, which would facilitate an approach. Boy, I smell food. I'm going to salivate to prepare my digestive system to eat the food. I'm going to approach the food, and I'm going to be generally inclined to be happy that the food is there if you'll allow for dogs to be happy. But notice that this was transferred to the experimental assistant. So in Pavlovian conditioning, what we saw then was the food as a stimulus object, right, was supplanted by the presence of the experimental assistant as a conditioned stimulus. And it elicited the same emotional response as the food did initially. So we can see that while we have a biological basis of emotion, in Pavlovian conditioning, they can be conditioned to new stimulus objects. That is, they can be transferred from a genetically determined stimulus object to a learned stimulus object. Operant conditioning essentially can cause the same transference, but it's a history of rewards and punishments. Okay? Social learning theory, that we can observe others' emotional displays and incorporate those emotional displays into our own psychological repertoire. Oh, or we can learn that, man, did you see that employee get angry at the boss and the boss totally shut him down and embarrassed everyone? And we learn that anger then is not an appropriate response to the boss, that the cost it carries may be more severe than we're willing to pay. And then, as I'm saying this, you can see that we've incorporated the notion of cost-benefit analysis. And anyone who's ever been angry and decided, oh my God, I'm so angry, I want to punch that person's face, but the consequences for that action would be too severe, so I suppress my anger, I suppress the behavioral impulse not to strike out because I'm afraid of the cost of striking out. So this then kind of implies a very strange situation, because emotions can be regulated, at least in part, and it may be on the basis of cost-benefit analysis sometimes. Is this a worthwhile emotional display, or are the consequences of this emotional display going to make it too expensive to really engage in? Kind of getting it? All right. Let's then talk about the two-system view. We have a stimulus event significant enough to trigger. We can have this two-path then, the social cultural learning history of the individual, that is your relationship to your own. And then the cortical structures and pathways really represent changes in the brain that took place as a result of learning and interacting in our environment. And then we have the evaluative, interpretive, conscious evaluation, right? The meaning and personal significance of the stimulus event. Now, some of you might argue that this box, right, might be a little further up, but basically what we're saying is here, based on the past and based on the culture, social past, cultural past, and individual past, right? We lay down these pathways, our brain changes as a result of our learning, and then that affects how we interpret the stimulus event, and that then is going to lead to emotional experience and or the decision to regulate that emotion. Now, the other part of the path is what we can't escape is our evolutionary history. So, our phylogenetic history of the species, that is, different species may in fact have different sets of emotion available to them, if you will allow for that, right? But this represents the subcortical structures and pathways, the non-conscious brain. That's really our genetic legacy, right? Is the result of the process of evolution. And this can be instantaneous and automatic reactions, right? That are not considered, that are not cognitively generated. And so we have this two-pathway system of emotion. Essentially, if we super want to simplify it, we have the conscious learned component of emotion, and then we have the non-conscious genetic component of emotion, and that leads to what we observe as our emotional state. And you might be getting to the idea that, well, which came first? And this is what Plutchik describes, as certainly a problem. It's an opportunity for understanding, but ultimately it's the chicken and egg problem. Cognition versus biology. Which came first? Does it matter? Probably not. It's a chain of events that aggregate into a relatively complex system of experience, behavior, perception, evaluation, right? So the stimulus significant event can arouse thoughts that can be arousing, or the opposite. This may be preparing for action. It generates feelings, and we're getting to the point in psychology of emotion now, dangerously close. In another 2 weeks or so, we're going to suggest, and we're starting to read things and talk about things, that these feelings occur, but they occur in a non-specific fashion, and we actually apply a label to name them as an emotion, right, to reduce our uncertainty. I got these feelings, and rather than live with these feelings of an uncertain nature, I place an emotion label on them to increase my certainty and kind of help diminish some anxiety around that. Now, the expressive displays and the overt behavioral activity. So you can see, in what order does all this operate? It depends, and I think we could create an example to demonstrate or we could create multiple examples to demonstrate different orders of operation, different sequences for all these components. Yeah. I know, that's a lot, and it's hard to pin down. And one of the reasons I love emotion, the study of emotion, teaching emotion, and motivation as well, is that the jury's out. I mean, there is so little evidence to support so many ideas in the realm of emotion. Motivation is actually quite a bit more straightforward than emotion is. So consider that while you're sitting through this course, and then maybe contemplating going into psychology of emotion. So the biological perspective then emphasizes primary emotions, anger, fear, etc. And they label them primary. Some people use the term basic. And for example, Paul Ekman said, hey, there's 6 basic emotions. And you say, oh, Paul Ekman, how do you know there's 6 basic emotions? He says, well, I had people make emotional expressions, and I photographed them. And then I took these photographs, and I traveled the world. And I would show these all over the world to all these different cultures and say, what is this expression? What is this expression? What is this expression? And if 95% of the people in that culture consistently and correctly named the emotional expression, then I'm going to call it basic. So this was how he determined what was a basic expression, is what's capable of being shown on the face. But other people don't necessarily agree, and that's one of the beauties of the study of emotion. There's a lot of room for disagreement. It's great for researchers and theorists. It's maybe not so great for students, right? So who want, hey, what is the answer? What is the right answer? And say, well, there is no right answer. And some students find that energizing and autonomy enhancing. Other students will find that somewhat threatening, right? Now, the cognitive perspective acknowledges the importance of primary emotions. So sure, there's primary emotions, but it stresses the complex secondary acquired emotions. And you say, well, what is a secondary complex emotion? Let's start with an easy one, biological perspective. The most solid lock of biological emotions, if you will, is fear. I see a snake, I'm frightened, I jump back. I jump back before I even realize that I was jumping back. Kind of a I see the fear, the visual thalamus sends the signal to the amygdala sends the signal to the motor cortex. This is all non-conscious process. I'm jumping before I even realize consciously that that's a snake necessarily, right? This kind of reactive behavior. Now the cognitive perspective says, wait a second, there are emotions that require cognition, And you say, well, what might be one of those? And let me pick on jealousy. First of all, how many of you would agree that jealousy is an emotion? And if you agree that jealousy is an emotion, and I'm not saying that I do or not, that's not where I'm going with it, but let's see what it takes to get jealous. That is, wow, here I am, and I'm observing an interaction between two people. One of those people I consider mine, right? And the other person seems to be attempting to take mine from me. And if that other person successfully takes mine from me, then I will no longer have mine. The other person will have mine. It will be theirs. And I will experience a loss as a result of this. There's nothing immediate about this. This required quite a bit of evaluation and cognition. So this is why I would consider jealousy then a complex rather than a basic emotion. Fear is easy. Snake, I jump, right? But no, the cognitive evaluative processes required for jealousy to be aroused. Now, that's not saying it can't happen in an instant. Didn't say that. But it is a complex emotion for that regard. So, and note that not everyone agrees on what are complex or basic emotions. And in fact, not everyone agrees on what is an emotion in the first place. Well, let me give you an example. Is love an emotion? And we can have a good long debate about this. This is something we obviously discuss in Psych of Emotion. Is love an emotion, or is it simply an act? Or is it a collection of characteristics that's better labeled a syndrome, which is a whole other issue. But let's look at the basic emotions. And fear, anger, disgust, sadness, joy, interest. A lot of people will agree that these, in fact, are basic emotions, right? At least one conceptualization. And then notice what happens. As soon as scientists develop a list of basic emotions, what do? They want to frickin' categorize them. These are negative emotions. And these are positive emotions, right? Many of us don't like the positive versus negative emotion categorization system. I'm not a fan at all. I'll get to other categorizations of emotion, but threat and harm generate fear, anger, disgust, sadness. But then right off the bat I can say, well, how does disgust represent threat and harm? I mean, if I open up a dirty diaper and I become disgusted, I rock back and say, oh my God, this thing reeks. I wasn't really under any threat or harm. So we can see how these conceptualizations can break down pretty readily. And then the positive emotions, motive involvement, satisfaction, joy and interest, certainly there's little to argue with there. But when we return to Paul Ekman, he's shown his photographs all around the world, and there was one emotion that was basic, that he identified as basic, that wasn't even on that list. Where the hell is surprise? Many conceptualizations of basic emotions include surprise. And Ekman provides pretty strong evidence for it, but then I'll always go back and turn the other corner and say, but does he? Right? And that's a bigger issue. What if we consider surprise more of a response than an emotion? And note, we get into a definitional issue here, right? But a worthwhile conversation. Where would surprise go in the negative or positive continuum? And notice we can be pleasantly surprised or unpleasantly surprised. And how does interest help with reconceptualization of the basics? Questions to consider, not necessarily to answer. So now we look at what good are the emotions, and that is, what are emotions good for? Well, I said emotions are for doing earlier in the lecture, right? So the utility of emotion. Maybe it provides a coping function, and it can certainly provide a social function. And let's look at kind of this functional view of emotions then. And again, there'll be argument, there'll be contention about this. So we take an emotion like fear. What then would be the likely stimulus situation that would generate fear? And well, if there's a threat, like I said, the snake, right? Well, so fear is in response to a threat, And its purpose then is to cause the experiencer of the emotion to run or fly away. But even this becomes problematic because we see with other conceptualizations of fear, it leads to the 3 F's. Freeze, flee, or fight. And notice, those are all fear responses that, let's say, a bunny rabbit might exhibit. Bunny rabbit will freeze if it detects a threat because it feels that freezing, it might just go undetected and the threat will pass. But if freezing doesn't work, then the bunny rabbit who is still afraid will flee. It will run like hell. But if the bunny rabbit is cornered, believe it or not, a bunny rabbit who's cornered and is afraid of what's going to happen, it will become aggressive and it will fight. So even a simple situation can yield a far more complex view of emotion. Now the function then, the function of fear is protection, and that one is consistent with the 3F model I just gave you. Now anger, we might see an obstacle. Biting or hitting might be the emotional behavior, and let's not do that at home, folks, right? And then destruction. But is that the case? Can you make a different case? Can you tell a different story about it? And let's go on down the list. Surprise, suddenly novel object, stopping, alerting, and then orientation as the function, which could make sense because if I'm surprised, then I want to devote greater levels of cognition, and we might call that orientation. But the functional view of emotion is kind of winning the day. The story is, what is it good for? And emotions are for doing. I will return to that point again and again and again. That's my camp. Emotion, action, tendencies. Emotions can instigate approach. Emotions can instigate avoidance. Or emotions can fix us in our tracks. These are the emotion, action, tendencies. Now, this is where when I take a point of view of emotion, action, tendencies, this functional view of emotions, notice that the distinction of positivity and negativity begins to fall apart in the explanation. Both fear and disgust lead to avoidance, for the most part. Fear can lead to risk avoidance, and this is where the hypothesis testing comes in. Davos, Mackey, and Smith, right, have, like, for example, given participants gambling games. And by priming them with fear, what we see then is people who've been primed with fear engage in less risky behavior in the laboratory in a gambling game, right? But let us now drive a wedge kind of in the negative positive conceptualization of emotion. Both anger and happiness lead to approach. So, but notice that one is a negative emotion and one is a positive emotion. I think it's really more interesting and more useful to be in the functional camp and talk about emotions in terms of what are they good for. But anger only leads to approach based on one's appraisal of successful action. But notice, this is only someone who has a relatively intact or robust regulatory system. My neighbor, right, has issues with anger. Not too long ago, he was driving and someone, like, I don't know, at least perceived by my neighbor, someone cut him off or somehow impeded, notice as an obstacle, had a little road event. And subsequent to this road event then, right, maybe someone changed lanes in front of him or whatever, he at one point got out of his car and produced a firearm and threatened the driver of that car with great bodily harm because my neighbor's an idiot and he's so angry. He has no impulse control. So the slightest thing, how many of you have been cut off? Do you jump out of your car and then threaten someone with a gun? Well, my neighbor did because he's got no self-regulatory prowess. He can't regulate his own emotions. And then what happens as a result of this? Well, he's reported by the motorist, and then the SWAT team comes, busts down his door, prones everyone out on the floor, and takes his 16 guns out of his home, right? My wonderful neighbor. So this is someone who now has to go to anger management training, who's on probation. He's got a list of felonies as long as our street, so that's his issue. But anger led to approach in this case. But happiness will lead to approach as well. So, but notice anger will lead to approach. Like I might want to punch my boss in the face after they screw me over for the umpteenth time, but I restrain my impulse. My self-regulatory powers are strong enough that I can say, yeah, I'd love to punch my boss's face because they screwed me over for the last time, but if I do, I will lose my job, I'll be arrested, all these negative consequences will occur. So my self-regulatory system prevents me from acting on my anger quite often. My neighbor doesn't have that self-regulatory system, so his anger then causes him to in fact engage in these activities. Anger leads to increased risk-taking. So when we're angry, we're more likely to engage in risky behavior. And again, more priming and more gambling paradigms in the laboratory, this time from Jen Lerner and Dasher Keltner. I believe we're at Berkeley at the time. Yeah, but both approach and avoidance are subject to cultural norms, especially gender roles. And this was my own research in my dissertation. And just briefly, what we discovered was we put people into an experimental situation. And what we found as part of the result is when people were asked how comfortable were they performing the task in the experiment, under fear stimulus, men reported they felt most comfortable approaching a fear stimulus. Whereas females in the experiment rated their comfort as highest when they were allowed to back up from a fear stimulus. And both groups were unaware of the stimulus itself. This was operating at a non-conscious level. And we found that kind of fascinating, right? So, again, the roles and identity can kind of shape our experience of emotion and what is appropriate response in that emotion. Let's face it, most of us boys have been raised, hey, confront your fears, approach your fears. Where many women are given the out as they're being raised that it's okay to be afraid and to rely on someone to protect you. Whereas men are often told you are the protector, you must approach the fear-evoking stimulus. This is part of our culture, and men would then feel a loss of male identity if they were to retreat from a threat, right? Whereas women are allowed that opportunity, all else being equal, right? So, and individual differences matter. This is just kind of a global approach, a global observation. Had enough of that yet? Let's talk some social functions of emotions. What do? They communicate our feelings to others. They influence others to interact with us. So when's the last time you saw someone who looks really angry and they're in a bad mood and you decided just to step aside and let them have their mood and go check in on them later when the mood is dissipated? All right? That anger told, stay the hell away from me. I'm not interested in socialization at this moment in time. Emotions can invite and facilitate interaction. That if we're happy and welcoming, then people might gravitate towards us. And they can create, maintain, and dissolve relationships. So to the extent that we interject increasingly negative affect, negative emotion into our relationship, we're pushing the relationship towards dissolution. To the extent that we interject higher levels of positive emotions, happiness, warmth, etc., then that might serve to enhance the relationship and maintain the relationship. Fascinating area of research. Now, can aggression be goal-directed? Well, instrumental aggression, what is it? One employs aggression to achieve a desired end state. So I threaten a child in grade school. I'm in grade school. I threaten another kid in an effort to take their lunch money. Notice that the aggression then was serving a purpose. It was instrumental in its employment. All right. Now, reactive aggression, and this is the latest kind of division. They used to call it instrumental versus emotional aggression too many issues were with the emotional aggression label, so it was changed. The adopted label now is reactive aggression. And here we see that reactive aggression is tied to the level of threat, and the bunny rabbit example that I gave you earlier applies. Low distant threat, we freeze, maybe to gain more information. You can see how it was adaptive, or to just go undetected. All right. The moderate, closer threat, then we instigate escape behavior, but once we're cornered, then we're left with reactive aggression. Questions about that? Not so much? Okay. Let's talk moods. As promised, we're going to differentiate moods from emotions, right? In a relatively simple, straightforward fashion. There's more to it than this, but if you want to go deeper on this, remember, we only have 2 lectures on emotion in this class. So if you want to go deeper, please take Psychology of Emotion. Now, the criteria, right, for emotions, what are the antecedents? Well, they emerge from significant life situations, appraisals of their significance to our well-being. And then the emotion influences behavior and directs specific courses of action. And the time course is usually relatively brief, right? Moods, on the other hand, you usually can't necessarily determine where this mood has come from. Often we'll wake up kind of in a bad mood and you say, God, I'm just in a bad mood today. And you think, why am I in a bad mood? You might not be able to pinpoint. I'm not with it today, right? And it influences cognition and what the person thinks about. So mood-dependent memory and mood-dependent cognition, quite common. And notice advertisers know this, and advertisers often try to create a mood that shapes the way you respond to the advertisement, to the product they're advertising. And then they emanate from long-lived mental events or states. So, when we talk emotion, usually there's a specific stimulus that evokes an emotion. So what they say is there's a clear onset, and then it runs its course over a brief period of time typically, and a clear offset that we're convinced, like if a bee comes buzzing in here and I'm allergic to bees, bzz, and I go, oh my God, I'm so afraid there's a bee, right? And don't sting me, Mr. Bee. And he listens to me and he says, okay, I won't sting you. And Mr. Bee leaves, and I say, whew, Mr. Bee left, I'm no longer afraid. Clear onset, clear offset, short duration, right? Which is different than a mood, that there may be dangerous things out here in the world that might hurt me, and I'm in a fearful mood over a protracted period of time, with nothing that clearly instigated it and nothing that clearly ends it. Okay? So everyday moods might be better described as positive and negative affect, or independent ways of feeling. So positive affect is pleasure engagement, reward driven. It can be appetitive, that means goal seeking, right? Approach behavior, and we see that dopamine is implicated at a neural level. Negative affect is usually unpleasant engagement, punishment driven, aversive motivational system trying to avoid, withdrawal behavior, which facilitates the avoidance to some extent, and we see that serotonin is more likely implicated in this, or noradrenaline, usually a reduced level of noradrenaline. Right? So we have 2 negative and positive affect systems. Now, positive affects, what are the benefits of feeling good? Well, when we feel good, we're more likely to engage in pro-social behavior. We're more likely to engage in creative pursuits, and probably more likely to be successful in the creative pursuits. Our decision-making efficiency might be enhanced. I think this is probably the least well supported on this list. Sociability, certainly, right? And persistence in the face of failure can be the result of positive affect, right? So the general benefits from maintaining a good mood can accrue as listed here. Now let's take a look at negative affect and persuasion, which I talked about advertising just a moment ago. Sad mood increases elaboration, and elaboration is an Ohio State social psychology developed term. Anthony Greenwald way back in the day, and then Rich Petty now OSU social psych attitude research said one of the most important things to understand about persuasion is how much does someone think about the persuasive message. And what this yielded to was the elaboration likelihood model, which is an Ohio State attitude research legacy, that there's two paths to being persuaded. And elaboration is the thoughtful thinking way, right? So a sad mood increases elaboration. Sadness tells us, and this is the functional aspect of sadness, I'm sad. And I ask, well, why am I sad if I don't know immediately? I search for the cause, and I think about, wow, I'm sad. But what it allows me to do is begin to devote my cognitive resources to thinking a way out of the sadness, right? So cognitive capacity is actually increased in the face of sadness. And Wegner and Petty then talked about, and Wegner is Petty's graduate student. He left to go to Purdue, and now he's back at Ohio State. So Wegner and Petty reunited in the group for attitudes and persuasion at Ohio State Social Psychology. Right? And this is the kind of thing that makes Ohio State Social Psychology Graduate School rank #1 in the country because of the quality of the research. Good mood. If I'm happy, I don't really want to think, because the danger of thinking too much when I'm happy is I might think myself out of that happiness, right? But when I'm sad, it really can't hurt. So we see that matching the nature of the message, trying to create the mood, then is in the service of perhaps elaboration on the message. Regardless, I want to leave us with the idea that certainly I'm of the camp, and so many people are, that emotions are for doing. They're about getting life done. And if that's not an argument for the motivational quality of emotion, I don't know what is, right? Because remember, our definition of motivation is energize and direct behavior. So emotions are really in the service of that, either putting the brakes on that energizing of behavior, right? Or increasing the energy in the behavior, but certainly directing the behavior. So this boundary line between motivation and emotion, I hope that I'm successfully blurring that boundary, that we don't believe motivations and emotions are as distinct as many people would have us believe, that they often operate in conjunction with each other in the service of each other. And I find that fascinating, and there is so much to learn in this area. So I'm a big fan of research in motivation, and certainly a big fan in research of emotion. I've participated in research in both. And in reflection, it's hard to separate the two. I mean, we can do it linguistically, and we can do it by making, little definitional differences. But certainly they work, and their effects and their stimuli coincide to a remarkable degree. So emotion and motivation, yeah, I'm down with that. Emotion and motivation. Two pieces to the understanding of the human miracle. Let's call it good, and let's say hey to Lexi. There's Lexi. This is Lexi at my mom's house years ago. My mom has since passed. About a year and 3 months ago, and one of my mom's greatest concerns was what's going to happen to Lexi, and we had always assured my mom that Lexi would in fact have a home with us, and she does. So, but think of poor Lexi living her life in the lap of luxury there as an only cat, and then my mom passes, and here comes Lexi into this zoo and this menagerie. It's been a transition for Lexi, but she's learning to groove on it, and I think she actually likes having the feline company, to which she had never really been exposed throughout her life. So Lexi, there you go. For better or for worse, you're with us now. So you guys have a great day, and we'll do this again sometime.